bit about the transition. And when I came out here, this is my marker of how long I've been in Colorado. I arrived on a Wednesday, and the following Tuesday was the first time that I came in this room and met so many people and was welcomed. And it kind of opened my eyes and challenged the way that I think in a lot of ways. In Florida, I was used to living in kind of enclave therapeutic communities where I had a lot of really, really great EMDR therapists that I would meet with on a monthly basis, and we do case conceptualizations and consultations. And I come here, and there's entire giant communities of people that are all working together, trying to live not just as the solution, but to help offer the solution to others. And I find it very, very powerful. And as I was asked to kind of do this talk, I sat back and reflected a lot on what I wanted to do. And I've had a lot of really wonderful mentors in my life, and a couple of the statements that they've said to me really started popping through my head. And the first one that came through my head was, in order to know where we're going, we have to know where we came from. Yeah, a little anxiety, sorry. In order to know where we're going, we have to know where we came from. And so I decided I want to do a little research. The second part is I'm kind of going to end with the second part. But I went on to our favorite Google Scholar, and I wanted to find what peer review information is out there and available for therapists who are looking to work with families with substance use disorders. And it was tough. When you look at modalities that are available for a person with substance use disorders, you've got a ton of peer-reviewed research. You've got constant people who are wanting to validate cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectic behavioral therapy. Well, addiction isn't a brain issue, it's a trauma issue, so we're going to use EMDR. All these different schools of thought that have tried to put numbers behind what we do. And when you start looking at families, you're seeing probably about 7% of what's put together for the person with a substance use disorder. When you do start finding some research, a lot of it's kind of archaic and old. A lot of what I found was very, very enclave-esque. I found a really, really great, amazing research article about indigenous Incans in South America who have alcohol use disorders and how it impacts their family. The issue is, it doesn't always parlay to the populations that we work with as individuals. When you look at the prevalence of substance abuse within the world, we're probably looking at about 100 million people, 100 million simply adults that are impacted as a secondary factor of addiction. So this isn't even siblings, this isn't aunts and uncles, we're not even getting outside of the big zone. I'm talking just parents and spouses, over 100 million people. I like to look at who made a joke about me thinking I was Danny made a joke earlier about me thinking that I'm a doctor. Not a doctor, a master's level clinician, but I always want to look at physiological evidence and signs of trauma, substance abuse, mental health disorders to understand where a person comes from. And when you look at the health impact of what it is to love someone with a substance use disorder, you start to see things that really do look like trauma. One of the weirdest questions that I've started asking families is gastrointestinal distress. How are you doing at keeping food down? How are you doing at processing food? Because we're seeing such prevalence of health issues secondary to substance use disorders in families. Sometimes you see people overeating because a lot of times as a culture we use food as our self-soothing. We use sugar as a way to kind of mediate and control our energy level. I love coffee. Let's just call it what it is. Even when you have a parent that doesn't meet criteria or isn't afflicted with substance use disorders, when you have that high level stress, so many times parents begin to have disordered drug use and disordered drinking also. Simply numbing the pain, disconnecting from reality, and not really digging in and feeling what's been going on. If you really want to dig into the medical stuff, there's a whole bunch of things that I don't even understand. How do you start to have a heart condition? Is it simply the cortisol levels and the stress? You know, when we talk about back pain, are we talking about gut biome dying because of the inability to process food appropriately, which then leads to the back pain associated with it? Societal impact is one of those things that's really hard to measure. I think the World Health Organization, UN, and European Union actually said we can't. There are too many moving factors. There's too many things that we can't measure and quantify. We can't get an accurate representation. Despite the fact that all these people have said we can't do it, World Health, Australia, and the United Kingdom tried to put numbers to it. And whether it's accurate or not, when you're talking about almost $5 billion a year affecting an economy of a country, it's not a joke. When we look at the behavioral impact, the relational impact, we see people who are no longer empowered to have a voice. If I stand up and have that voice within my family, my loved one claims they're going to relapse and it's going to be my fault. So what happens if I have that voice at my workplace? We live in a society where trust is very, very fragile already. We are a very, very divided country, and the existence of and the prevalence of substance use disorders and the lack of care can't be helping. The support that's out there is available. The issue is, so many of these families don't know where to get it. And if they do know where to get it, the idea of going out alone, simply making that phone call, walking into a room and saying, I don't know what to do anymore. What I'm doing isn't working, is petrifying. So then we have a family that needs help, but they have so much anxiety about getting help that they're not getting help. Historically, the care has been not really healthy, but we'll call it nice. This was a really interesting part of my reading, going back into like the 50s and 60s and seeing what clinicians were doing with families. We talk a lot about like moving recovery away from a place of shame into a place of empowerment. And yet, we very regularly still engage in shame with the families. Josh and I had this really great conversation one day because I didn't have a better phrase for, the families are almost as sick as the clients, if not sicker. Well, of course they're going to be. I mean, imagine Narcaning your eldest child in the bathroom floor on a Christmas day. Like, how could you not? The humiliation that exists in trying to, talk to a bunch of normal people who know nothing about substance abuse and saying, my son has been using IV heroin, he now has hepatitis C, and I'm not allowing in my home. We shut down as a society and we don't talk about it. And part of that not talking about it then once again raises this divide and kind of separates us and pushes us away. That's not me, is it? Oh. And then there's even worse shame that came about. Parents were blamed. Well, what did you do wrong to your kid that made them go into this path? Wives were told that they had an investment in their husband's addiction. And that in order for the husband to get sober, he had to leave her because she was so invested in it that she was going to keep him addicted. Husbands were told that it's because they don't have enough interest in their wife and they don't care. We go into this shame-based model that has perpetuated for so long. Some of the more common things that come up with family, we have this worry that is constantly proliferating everything in life. So instead of being able to be a person who is multifaceted, we drop down, we stop using coping skills. Hobbies go away, self-care goes away. And now we have families that simply identify as the mother of a person who's addicted. And they lose their ability to connect with everything else. The maintenance of quality relationships goes away. I was telling Kevin earlier, now that I'm not living in his house, when he comes into town, I'm not getting to sit down and have fel with him every month. These quality of relationships take time. They take effort. They take energy. I'm sure I walk in and I observe a lot. And I don't think everyone in this room is best friends, but there's a lot of relationships here. And you all are best friends, though. But it takes investment, right? And one of the blessings that y'all have is you spend 40 hours a week together. Automatically. We invest so much energy in these relationships, and I call it self-care. Time with people we care about helps make everything else more manageable. But when you start to have someone who you're worried is going to die, you cease investing in the relationships that feed your character, that feed your energy, and you start to focus on someone who doesn't. Everyone's always worried about the children, but they stop to worry about themselves. So we have a person who's a substance abuser, and we have And it's kind of funny having this conversation in this room where so many children of people with substance use disorders get help and get education and learn that life can be better. And when it comes to the families, we don't take care of ourselves. In the EMDR community, in the trauma world, there's a lot of analogies that we use to help people understand the importance of taking care of yourself. My absolute favorite analogy that they use is the airplane analogy, right? Like, the exits are over the wings. Put the seatbelt on, tighten the strap. If an oxygen mask comes down, put the mask on yourself first and tighten the straps before helping anyone else. Because if that oxygen pressure goes out, you lose consciousness, guess what? You can't help anyone. And yet so often, when we're talking to families that are loving a person with substance use disorder, they're not taking care of themselves. They're spending all of their energy and time taking care of others. Societal expectations are kind of a joke, right, Blanche? Society tells Blanche that she's got to always be high energy and going strong. Society tells me as a man I should be stoic and not express my emotion. I should be able to handle things on my own. There's a ton of other cliches that I just absolutely hate. One man is an island? No. It just doesn't work like that. But some people who don't have the privilege and the honor of having people in their life that can step up and say, hey, when you need help, you ask me, and I'm going to show up for you. I'm going to show up in your life appropriately. We get kind of caught up in this world of clinical care and surrounding ourselves with other clinicians and people that are kind of healthy, and we get used to being able to have people show up. But when we step outside of these bubbles of care, most people don't have that. And being able to challenge that societally. I think I've talked about shame and dishonor enough. And I think that the research kind of identifies three styles of families. That when these moments come up, especially when it comes to an adolescent, families tend to go into one of three modes. First, they engage the problem, they identify it, and they do what they can to try to make a change. This is like the 15-year-old kid that gets caught with weed at school for the first time, and immediately they say, all right, we're sending you to residential treatment. We're going to get a professional, we're going to get professionals involved, we're going to nip this in the bud before it's an issue. Fortunately, it doesn't tend to be the predominant family identity, right? Traditionally, a family says, well, it's kids being kids. Oh, it's just pot. Oh, kids are going to drink, it's going to be okay. And they tolerate it, and they say, we're going to try to mediate this, which is harm prevention route, which I'm a big fan of in many cases. But when you're talking about a 15-year-old, every family's got to make their decision where they're going to stand. And then the more common one that I see is the withdrawal. When we talk about it from a trauma-based model, we call it disassociation. This is everything happening right in front of your face and not having the ability to stand up and make any change, to have a voice, or to challenge it. It's one of the most natural things that the brain can do. When we don't know what to do and we're so overwhelmed by life and what's on our plate, we shut down. Protects our features. We can go medical model if you want. You have head trauma. It's the first thing your body does. It goes unconscious. The last thing that the brain can do when it's been damaged is deal with having a personality. So it shuts down and it simply takes care of what it can take care of for that word that we talked about earlier, survival. I'm going backwards. So family care in the current category. Three styles of families. There's the controlling family. I will make you be sober. We can paint this in many, many different models, but a lot of times I think of this as the dad that wants to send you to boot camp. This is the mom that will yell and scream at you and take the keys away and never explain why. There's such control forced with this. There's people that, kind of repetitive from the previous one. When we help families, we protect them from the effects. We're going to send you to grandma's for a while. Maybe it's time for a physical change of atmosphere. And one of the things that I know that we talk about on a regular basis as clinicians, how do we teach them to be more supportive? How do we teach the families who have been so beaten down and so traumatized to have a voice? to be able to be assertive. So what do? We educate them. We try to do as much psycho ed as possible to help them understand. So before I came out here, when I first entered my career in Florida, I worked in residential treatment. 30 days. 30 days and you're going to change your life. I was taught one thing for family care. Get the family to buy in and keep them in treatment. Okay. So that's what we did. We got the family to buy in and keep them in treatment, and how did that work out? Maybe they finished 30 days. Maybe the family learned a little bit about boundaries. The other model is, getting the families to join them in treatment. So you've done some work on yourself and you've started to stabilize. So now we're going to bring the family in and we're going to do things that I've seen work. Confrontation letters, identifying and helping the person write a letter to the family identifying how they believe their behaviors have affected them. But we have this third wave coming in where instead of, as treatment modalities, trying to integrate the family into the client or keep the client doing what they're supposed to do, instead we're starting to reach out and help the families. A lot of times this doesn't fall under the label of psychotherapy or mental health counseling, but it falls a little bit more under lines of coaching or, Kevin, what's the phrase that you use? Never mind. Case management. Essentially putting accountability together for the family and figuring out what the family needs. Because it's hard working in the modality of treatment and making the family the priority. So we help find them resources. We give them a little bit of accountability about their own work and their own care. But then the parents have issues with that, don't they? I want to know what's going on with my loved one. Well, there's confidentiality things. I don't care. I'm paying for their treatment. Okay. So we have a traumatized individual who is hypervigilant about what's going on with their loved one, all the stuff that we already talked about, and they want to re-traumatize themselves because they need to know what injection site was he using, who was selling it to him, what neighborhood was he going to. We as clinicians struggle with jargon. It is so much easier for me in a conversation with another professional to say, oh yeah, substance use disorder. Well, what does that mean? Major depressive disorder recurrent. What does that mean? And a lot of times I find myself getting stuck in these patterns with families where I'm talking in ways that they're not understanding. And being able to kind of challenge that as individuals that this is our wheelhouse, this is what we do, this is how we communicate, but to learn another language to help get these information shared with the families. Interventions are great, but someone said, I work with a family for 2 days, and then I work with a client for 2 hours. And then what? I loved the talk last month. Now, we had a gentleman come in here, if you weren't here, who talked about what drug court is, how it's supposed to work, and how powerful it can affect someone in their life. But we go back to a traumatized family model, and I had this conversation yesterday. He's got court in 10 days. What are we going to do? What do you mean, we? He's got court. His lawyer's going to be there. He's identified a sober support that's going to go with him. How are you going to do anything in court to help? Families don't know how to communicate to outside friends. To be able to have that voice, to be able to say, this is my current life status, this is what's going on, and this is where I'm struggling. Sometimes one of the hardest things for the families is recognizing where their story ends and their loved one begins. It becomes so enmeshed that even the idea of sitting down and talking to a close friend, the boundaries become so blurred, and instead of talking about your life and how it's impacted you, families will then just simply share their loved one's story. A lot of the research talks a lot about clergy support and the power that it can be to connect with your spirituality and your faith and find support for the struggle that you're going through, which is awesome when you have a member of the clergy who understands. There's not a lot of education out there for it, just like there's not a lot of education out there for police, for teachers, for lawyers, for dentists. Had a friend who went through dental school. Substance use disorders were never discussed, and he had to have a conversation with me where I told him he was part of the problem because he was just giving giant opioid prescriptions out. Like, I had my wisdom teeth taken out. I had Advil. It's fine. So often, a lot of relapses begin with simple lack of communication with medical providers like that. So what about the family? What are we going to do to try to help them? One of the biggest things is we were talking about before I came out here is the idea that some of these families don't even recognize where their own sickness lies. Part of what I like to do is to engage a little bit of motivational interviewing. Help them understand what they're going to get out of it. This isn't about the fact that your son's in treatment. This is about what's occurring in your life and how you can live a better, happier, more fruitful life. Helping them find that change-based conversation. Families will never understand what it's like to be active in addiction. They'll never understand what it's like to be under a fire of gasoline, and every time you come out to get a grasp of air, the only thing you can think of doing is jumping right back in that gasoline. I don't think it's our job to help them. But it can be our job to educate them a little bit more about, recovery is not a linear process for a lot of people. There's ups and downs. And just because a person's sober doesn't mean that they're in emotional recovery at this moment. I believe because of my EMDR background, the school of thought that I come from, the way I view the world, that any family that presents for help with a loved one is presenting and asking for help with trauma. So I like to recommend a trauma therapist. Again, I'm EMDR trained, I'm EMDR certified, so I tend to go to that wheelhouse. But I'm sure a lot of you know somatic processing and a ton of other different really great ways to move these things out of the central nervous system. I think medical care is a really important factor for the families. I believe there's a time and a place for a lot of mental health drugs, and I think that a lot of families really need to have a little bit of a jump start at times. I think it's different for every family, but when we talk about those physical health symptoms, we're talking about things that long-term kill people. Cardiovascular health, gut health, even just simple depression, to complex depression. And most of these families, this loved one's issue is not the first time that they've experienced trauma. And unfortunately, when we have trauma on trauma on trauma, all it does is concrete and solidify these beliefs about what the world is and what humanity is. That we will not be able to find help, we will not be able to find support, and once again, I will be abandoned. I'm a fan of spirituality and faith. I'll put that out there. You can have your own opinion and belief on it, but I think that finding like-minded people that are pointing you in the similar direction to believe in a better tomorrow is one of the best things that a person can do for their mental health. And we're not marketing, but one of the big things about Red Rocks is a sense of community. We talk about circles over rows a lot, and I contemplated asking them to make a big circle for me today. Because when we're all in a level playing field having this conversation together, we're so much more powerful than who we are when we're alone. I started off in the beginning of this conversation talking about the mentors that I've had in my life. And there's a lot of people in this world that I've never gotten a chance to meet, but I find to be just amazing human beings. Winston Churchill is one of the most famous alcoholics in all of existence. The man would put bottles and bottles of brandy down at a time. However, he did say, success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is the courage to continue that counts. And we as an industry have had moments of shining bright light and moments of failure. And my challenge today is that we don't have to continue the psychology of our forefathers. We can kind of challenge and change things. And so one of the things that I really want to help identify and have this community push for in terms of independence is helping these families have a little bit less worry. I don't think it's going to go away. I don't think it's possible to make it go away. Try talking to a mother of a 25-year-old who is currently on the streets running and gunning and saying, it's okay, sleep well tonight. It's not going to happen. But identifying that her life is her life, her loved one's life, and they don't have to feed back and forth and have that enmeshment is powerful. Teaching people boundaries is a really big deal. And even boundaries within oneself. I had a really difficult conversation with a friend of mine yesterday, and she just doesn't believe that she has the right to be happy because of her family. Like, you have the right to be happy. You have the right to say no to anyone. If you all want to hang out and have coffee afterwards, that's That's nice. I can say no. I don't have to do anything that anyone wants me to do if I don't want to do it. And so many of these families are in this mindset, if I don't go take care of him, he's going to die. Well, if you do go take care of him, guess what's going to happen? It's going to postpone it another day. We're not making any change. We're living in the exact same life. And it's got to change. I like to get families involved in activities, whether it be about recovery or just going for a hike with their family that's healthy. Physical activity, getting outdoors. I mean, we live in Colorado. Where are we? We're an hour from the foothills. We could be in some of the most beautiful and scenic spots in this country. And part of some of the assignments I give families is simply that. I want you to grab your fishing rod and go fishing. Well, how's that therapeutic? Don't ask me. Just go do it. And then I want you to do a mood log about the time that you're out there and tell me how many times while you were fishing did you experience happiness? How many times did you have a fleeting moment of joy, excitement, taking time out from the chaos? We have a landing zone. We call it a landing zone. When a client first comes into treatment, they get a month away from everything. You can't have a cell phone until you earn it. You earn a cell phone, all right, but you don't get to talk to your family yet. You got to earn that too. Being able to give them the ability to get away from that chaos and take care of themselves. Quality of life goes very, very hand in hand. So this is where I'm going to kind of change format a little bit. Because if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I identified in the very beginning of this talk that when I walked into this building 6 months ago, I was greeted very warmly by professionals who really understand things in ways that sometimes I don't. There's people in here who have wheelhouses and understanding that I have had zero training in, zero understanding in. And so I don't really do lectures. I'm a group guy. I like to get other people to speak. I like to empower other voices to be heard. And one of the things about this conversation is all I've talked to you about is what's happened. I haven't talked to you about anything that we'd like to do or anything that we could do. Because while I have ideas, I don't have the answers. One of the things that I've really loved about this is I'm not a good social media person, but the social media for this group is really great. I need a person who specializes in self-harm, who takes Aetna, who's willing to see someone 3 times a week. Who do you recommend? This entire community comes together rapidly, referring friends and colleagues and people that they've met at trainings and seminars. And we kind of had this conversation, well, what about when you got a family that's in Chicago? You know, there's a lot of our organizations out there that I think are absolutely phenomenal. TPAS is one of my favorites. It's Treatment Professionals and Alumni Services. I want to say they've been around for coming up on close to 10 years at this point. And they've created an entire network of alumni organizations that if you complete treatment at any number of treatment centers and you decide, I'm going to move to Colorado. Every TPAS in Colorado you're now welcome at. If you're going to go play kickball with them, they'll toss you on a team and welcome you into the community. While we have so many resources in this area, Kevin and I did not have this conversation ahead of time about people in Florida and Washington and all wanting to do this, but it's kind of the conversation that I want to start today. Is what can we as a community do? I don't know if we call it the Denver model, the Rockstars model, but what can we do as a community to get together, to kind of get some ideas, and to begin to share it, maybe beginning on a local level and getting it to a national level? Because each of you do things that I don't. Like, I love being here. There's a reason. I don't like working with kids. They do. And so every opportunity I get to take one of my adult clients and send their children through this program, I'm going to take. There's a woman I met here, and I don't think she's here today. She does work specifically only with mothers. Mothers working with mothers. And being able to find that sense of community. Like, we share resources to a certain degree, and that was one of the hardest things about Florida, is resources were never shared. If you had a really great intervention and modality that you engaged in, it's mine. I really want us to be able to share information and to get to the point that maybe we can start putting some numbers together. We've got a ton of really great universities nearby that specialize and have PhD programs in statistics, where we have interns that are begging to find data sets that they can work with. But we tend to stay in our what was it? Stay in your lane? Was that the line today? We tend to stay in our lane as therapists. I am not medical. I can't speak for medical. I'm not a nutritionist. I can't speak on nutrition. I'm a mental health therapist. That's what I can speak on. I want us to get out of our lane. I'd really love for us to be able to, as a community, decide on something that we can all work together towards, start collecting some data. And unfortunately, this is the resentment I'm trying to work on still to this day. Get some peer-reviewed science together so that insurance companies are willing to pay for the family care and not call it an adjustment disorder. To get in the DSM-5-TR some sort of a family diagnosis that we can do to help these families not have a label that probably doesn't fit and follow them around for years. I don't even know what time I'm at. Oh, sweet, I have plenty of time. I also talk a little too fast, but that's fine. Just like Kevin's talking about, Kevin wants to find someone who can act as a leader for this. I want to find someone who can act as a leader for these as an entire community, so that we're not standing here alone as clinicians dealing with parents who have anger management issues, calling at 11 o'clock at night screaming and yelling, so that we can immediately have, hey, I've got a group for dads. They're not local, but they telehealth. I kind of want to open it up and see what we as a community you think we can do to best serve these families, because one of my passions is underserved populations, and from the moment that I entered this industry, families were always that. They played second fiddle. And I know you're inviting a ton of families out for every single event, because it's a whole lot more fun watching a game with Dad being sober than it is wondering where he is. It's fantastic being able to go to a concert with Dad and being able to show them you can have fun and be sober. I don't even need to start with you. Like, the amount of families getting together, making music, and using different modalities. Like, to have family art groups. Like, these are the future. Has anyone found any, assessments that they use with families? Has anyone been able to put any numbers together that they've been using to try to look at what you're doing? To try to see if you've got numbers that show that you're pointing in the right direction? I know I'm not. So I guess that's our challenge. Like, if we want to all get together and we want to put some numbers together, I'm happy to be a resource and to help spearhead it. I am not the numbers guy. I am not super organized guy. I'm also not always the best of leaders. But I want to be part of a team that can help create and make change. And if that's an hour a month after we have our Family Rockstars meeting, I'm in. If it's simply an email chain of clinicians that are doing a little bit of pre and post testing, let me know. But I kind of want to, I made a joke about inviting everyone out for coffee afterwards, but I kind of do. I don't know where the closest Starbucks is. I don't know if we could just hang out in this room and just have a conversation right there. But I think that this is a conversation that I wanted to start today and see how far we can take it. Because, we start healing from the top down. That's how all cultures are created. If you have a sick organization, you tend to have sick leadership. When you get a family that starts to get healthy, traditionally it starts off at the top. So I ran through my speech a little bit faster than I anticipated. Get it.
I hope you can. But if you can, it's okay. It's kind of theoretical. If every person did EMDR and processed and dealt with and healed from their trauma, would there be no more mental health problems?
No, there would still be. While trauma is a source for many, many issues, a lot of things are organic. And even if you fully work your way through the process of EMDR and you fully desensitize and you bring those triggers down, unfortunately, in many ways, a lot of EMDR isn't permanent. You got to do tune-ups because, I don't know, try erase marker. So the way that I describe trauma, how do I do this? Give me a black screen. Yeah. The way I describe trauma for people is that when we have an event that occurs in our early childhood, like, I don't know, Mom walks up and pinches me on the side of my waist and says, "Oh, looks like you're getting kind of fat, Rudy." I get this little teeny piece of sand inside my brain. Not physically, but like I have this negative core belief that suddenly tells me I'm not going to be enough. And it's fine if it just stays that way, only life goes on. And then life goes on and we keep feeding these particles of sand, whether it be being in third grade and being pushed down off the slide. High school, my girlfriend cheating on me with my best friend. College, failing a class that I thought I was doing great in because I have dyslexia and I can't do math well. These things start to form and form giant bubbles. And no matter how much EMDR we do, we can't get everything. And so we end up with maybe 2 or 3 negative core beliefs that the level of disturbance was maybe a 2 and it was never worked on. Only that little 2 then opens up for new core beliefs to come in. And so even with EMDR, even with like really serious, great long-term work, things still come up because we keep living. And whether we're talking about big T or little t, we still have things that feed that negative internal core belief. I don't think that trauma can create schizoaffective or anything that falls into that kind of category. Even major depressive disorders, anxiety does kind of fall into that EMDR realm. They're getting more peer-reviewed science to back it up, but I would still say that like I wouldn't call it evidence-based quite yet. And it's one of the things that the more conferences you go to, especially when it comes to trauma, there's people preaching from the pulpit. Pre-post test, collect numbers, collect data. Because, you know, when we look at, I'm going to branch out really broad now, getting away from substance abuse. When we look at psychology in general, a lot of it was just based on guessing for so long. Like, how do you measure an id? It makes sense that there's this like subconscious like thing in there that feeds everything else, but like, how do you measure it? Like if we can't measure it, if we can't find evidence to back these different modalities up in care, we're going to have issues like have occurred with the, how many people here have done equine therapy? It was one of the most powerful moments when Kevin and I first met and we went to that trauma retreat. He sat there with his hand on my shoulder as I was petrified of this giant horse, even though I had to remain cool and collected. Kevin sat there with his hand on my shoulder, and this horse looked at me, and it walked right up to me. And it was amazing standing next to this prey animal with my hand on its side. They then collected the group back together, and Brendan Moore goes, "Hey, Rudy, you want to come back over here?" "No. I'm going to stay over here with my horse buddy." Do I believe equine therapy can be helpful in any number of things? Yeah, I really do. But you saw what happened down in Florida with the insurance companies and people abusing equine therapy and not really using it how it's supposed to be used. And the insurance companies have taken it away. Why? Because there's not enough peer-reviewed science for it. And so I love working with people, but I don't get to work with everyone I want to work with. Because if someone comes in and they want help and they don't have insurance and they don't have money, unfortunately, I'm a business. And I can't do everything I do for free. There's a time and a place that I can, but I can't dedicate my entire life to giving free services. And so until we can get the insurance companies to recognize and say, oh, there's 75,000 peer-reviewed journal articles that have been written in the past 5 years about this modality of care across the United States and the world that shows this is evidence-based, we continue to have problems and have underserved populations that we can't help. And that's, again, stats not my wheelhouse. what underserved populations really are. I went off on a tangent with that, but I hope I answered your EMDR question. Yeah.
What do you think is something that we can all be doing better when we're talking to families about getting their own help?
The language we use. I am really working hard on a lot of things in my own life. One of them is black and white language. He's always going to act this way. He's never going to act this way. Helping the families understand that when we talk in that manner, we're essentially like taking this personality style that desires everything to be all or nothing, white or black, up or down, and being able to challenge that that's not our reality. Was this the best talk you've ever heard? No. Was this the worst talk you ever heard? Definitely no. Life occurs somewhere in the middle, and I think that being able to recognize where our means are and how we live within those standard deviations, that's where reality is. So I like to challenge them to not use always and nevers in their own personal life. I've been working really hard in this talk to not go back to my old way of talking and to talk about drug addicts and alcoholics and to call it people who suffer from substance use disorders. I challenge, like, it was a really great thing about the talk last week also, the idea of what an offender is. Like, that's a label that can follow you. It's part of who you are. Like, there is a time and a place to say that you're an alcoholic. There's a time and a place, but what about mom and dad saying that? So going into kind of the medical model of identifying who a person is. I have a loved one who struggles with a substance use disorder. I have a loved one who struggles with depression. These aren't simply an identifier. I'm not a therapist. That's just part of who I am. I do psychotherapy for a living, not my sense of identity. And being able to challenge people, I'm nothing but a liar. Well, you lied right there, but that doesn't mean that that's all that you are. You've lied to me on many occasions. When was the last time you told me the truth? I think that, like, when I talk about the divisiveness, I think that black and white, all or nothing, yes or no, right or wrong, and we as humans with this beautiful ego that wants to always be right. Like, I'm not always right, and I don't have the answers, but I really have a huge desire for us to find them together. I think that's one of the best things we can do is change the way we talk about it. And be less afraid to talk about it in public. Like, 1% of the world is a direct relative up the food chain, either spouse or parent of a substance abuser. What was that number? 200 billion? Somewhere in those slides. A lot, right? So the odds are you probably know someone, and they're also calculating that based upon the entire population of the world. I'm sure that there's wonderful small sections of the globe that don't have this struggle in the way that we view it, and we have it here in Colorado or in America. And so I would guess that number is probably a little bit higher when we come into metropolitan areas like this. And we, as clinicians, we live in a bubble. I'm sure there's people in this room who'd have a hard time finding someone who doesn't have substance use disorders affecting their lives. We branch out a little bit. I like to make up numbers that have absolutely no science behind them also. Let's call it 50%. I don't know. But I would say probably close to that in this major metropolitan area have at least someone that they know. With the prevalence of meth and opioids in this area, how could you not? If you have a child who's in 12th grade and you're friends with all of his friends' parents, odds are you're going to find multiple. So having this conversation and not being afraid of it anymore. Silence is death. During the AIDS epidemic, in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, we had a community in New York who was some of the most powerful and most vocal advocates because they knew silence would equal death. And yet here we are, we're allowing some of these families to be silent because they're not ready. Instead of coaching them on what it's like to talk about this Maybe not in a huge public forum, but at least with family, maybe with friends. Faith-based fellowship. Oh my gosh, what if my priest found out that my son's an opiate addict? You know, maybe he'd give you a hug and ask you how you're doing today. Oh, yeah. We get into these trauma bubbles and we start to think the world is very, very different than it actually is. We watch the news and we start to think that the world is the way that it is. It's the worst of the worst. Walk down the street and make eye contact with a couple people. See how many people say hello. I got 4 hellos on the way into the building from people I've never met before, simply because I kept my eyes up and made eye contact. I get up on soapboxes a lot if you haven't noticed. Any other questions? Well, Starbucks in 10.
Starting an organization, put it together, post it on our Family Rockstars Facebook page, and we'll generate some activity on that.
Nice.
Okay, sound good? Great, fantastic. Hey everybody, thanks for coming. Next month.
Oh yeah, next month.
Yeah, I just checked the schedule.